All right, good afternoon, everyone. Tom and I are pleased to be here to sort of end the afternoon and talk to you about student discipline issues. You might be sick of hearing about them by now from us, but as you heard from a number of people throughout the day today, this is an issue that we are going to have to address in the upcoming session, and so we think it's very important that we all work together and we work with our partners at VAS and other associations to help to ensure we get the best outcome we can in this area. So what I want to do is give a brief recap of some of the issues, some of the legislation that we saw last session, so we know what we're up against. There was a handful of bills. There were 6 bills. They started off identical in the House and the Senate on 3 different issues. The first was a set of bills to limit the duration of long-term suspensions, and it started off as 90 days. There were various iterations of the bills. 60 days, 45 days was the shortest amount of time we saw. We did defeat that legislation. We defeated all 3 of these ultimately at the end of the day. None of them passed, but we're going to see them again, which is why we're talking about them. So limiting long-term suspensions. The next one was prohibiting long-term suspensions for disruptive behavior, regardless of how many times a student engaged in disruptive behavior, regardless of the circumstances. These bills would have prohibited the use of long-term suspensions for disruptive behavior. And then the third set of bills would have prohibited suspensions or expulsions for any students in grades K through 5. One version of the bill was K through 3. One version of the bill would have allowed us to do a short-term suspension. Another version of the bill wouldn't even allow a short-term suspension for the younger students. And if you were paying attention earlier, you heard Gillespie mention this as one of his priorities. I don't believe the video from Lieutenant Governor Northam mentioned this, but it's one of, if you look on his website, it's one of his priorities. So I think we're going to see it either way. It's also one of Senator Stanley's priorities. He was one of the patrons of all 3 of these bills, and the last time I talked to him, this is his real sticking point. So he may bring them all back, but certainly this suspensions of students in K through 5 is a big issue for him. So we're probably going to see it from a number of sources. I think it's going to be a focus, and so we need to think about how we're going to address that. So there's 2 primary things that we all need to be doing, not just me and Jeremy and our team at VSBA, and not just Tom with VAS. These are things that we all need to be doing to be in the best position we can when the session comes around. Number 1 is we need to be in a position to propose some alternatives to this legislation that would prohibit our ability to suspend and expel students. We have to come up with some alternatives because, as we've heard from the legislative panel, the candidates for governor, they want to do something in this area, so we need to have something besides these bills we don't like to offer. And then second, we need to continue our efforts to lobby against these bills that would limit our ability to suspend and expel when necessary and appropriate. So this legislation that we ultimately defeated, it had a lot of strong bipartisan support, and it took a lot of work from a lot of people, including many of you in this room, to defeat that legislation. And it was down to the wire the last minute before the last of those bills was killed. And so this issue has certainly gained even more momentum than it had last year. And so if all we do is keep doing what we've been doing, we're going to get steamrolled, and we'll see these bills pass, and we won't get any good out of it. So we really need to continue our efforts to lobby against these measures, but we've got to do something else too, and that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about. So one of the things that VSBA is doing is we have developed a task force on this specific issue of student discipline. We are working with VAS and Tom and Ben at VAS, and then we've also invited a number of other associations, the PTA, the VEA, and the secondary and elementary school principals associations to work with us, because I think if we can identify some common goals and some common steps that we can all take, we're much more likely to be successful and to have the legislators listen to us. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to talk a little bit about what we're doing with this task force.
Thank you. First off, I want to say thank you to everybody in this room that was engaged in what we did last winter with the suspension bills. Your interaction with your delegates and senators are the primary reasons in which we were able to fend off some very difficult situations. Stacy and I work up there, and as the other Vels that are in here work on a daily basis, but they need to hear from you. And so part of what VAS and VSBA and the others are trying to do is help you all gain some information and get you to a point to educate your delegates and senators about what you do in your buildings. I was in the public schools for 32 years. I was a hearing officer in our locality for 20 of those years and was superintendent for the last 8. And so discipline, whether it's suspension or expulsion, is a very, very difficult situation. It is often the last resort after having worked through some very difficult times with young people. And that's one of the things that we need to be able to communicate to our delegates and senators, what it's like in the real world. If you go to the code, there are only 2 groups that are officially charged with school safety: school boards and superintendents. So that's a message that we need to put out there, because when you go to Richmond and they pass a bill that impacts this, it is your jobs to implement it and still keep schools safe. Now, part of what we wanted to do today is, because the task force is looking at, how did we get to this point? Where, suspension and expulsion and the difficulties that we're talking about are not new issues. If you've been around these tables as long as I have, we've dealt with this before. Years ago, it was because we weren't suspending enough kids. And it wasn't because school safety was an issue, because we weren't providing safe environments. And now we've come full circle back to this way of saying, no, we need to look at what the outcomes are. Now, the task force is looking at three pinpoints or points to look at in terms of past recommendations. If you don't know that in 2006, the Commission on Youth began a 3-year study on alternative education programs. And they looked at suspensions and expulsions as part of those programs. In 2009, they finished and gave out their final report and came to some conclusions with regard to alternative ed. One, that they didn't know what alternative ed meant, that there was not clarity across the state in what we were talking about. And one of their recommendations was to put a definition in the code of what alternative ed is. Second, that schools needed guidance in how to develop quality alternative programs, because when they surveyed school divisions across the state, they had all types of programs that were being offered. And so schools, they felt, needed guidance in helping to develop a quality program. And they were going to ask the Department of Education to develop those guidelines. And then the last 2 were, one, there was an extreme shortage of what's called school-based prevention programs, whether that's PBIS or school-wide discipline. that those were beginning to be implemented in the schools, but there was a shortage across the Commonwealth, and that school staff and educators needed more training, and that there should be more money for that. And that came up to 2009. What also happened in 2009? The recession. Money dried up. I'm not sure that any of these recommendations were acted upon. We worried more about putting teachers in the classroom and being able to fund that. That was the primary goal. Now, we went through the recession, and as suspensions actually have dropped from that point. But there appears to be disparities between who is suspended and how long they're suspended for. And so in 2011, a coalition was formed around Just Children and some child advocacy agencies, and they put out a report and that made some recommendations. One, that if you had a high suspension rate as a school division, you were going to be required to do some changes, some implementations. They did recommend that these kinds of changes were going to cost money, and so there needed to be added resources, and that the department or the Board of Education should take a stronger hand in developing a model school discipline policies. That happened. That didn't happen. And so in 2016, when the classrooms to courtrooms movement took place, another report was released by the same coalition in 2016, and that is what we're seeing the results of basically with the bills that we have seen in the past General Assembly. One, that limits should be put on suspension and expulsion. Two, that they should redefine what long-term suspension is, not to allow you to suspend more than 90 days, and that more emphasis should be given on these prevention and behavioral programs. They did also talk about money and the fact that we need money. So if you're going to start to connect dots, and we're going to talk about that later, what are we seeing that the proposals that have been put forth in the past are coming to? One, there's not a good definition of alternative programs. What does it mean and what does it do? Two, our staffs need more training. And three, well, four then, three, limiting suspensions, and four, all of this is going to cost more money. And so those are some of the themes that we think we're going to begin to see when we move into the 2018 General Assembly.
And actually, I want to talk a second about this, the 2016 Just Children Suspended Progress Report. So when Just Children came out with this report, and they talked about the numbers of suspensions and expulsions and some of that data, and they had a number of recommendations, as Tom mentioned. What they did was they distributed this report to every member of the General Assembly. And that's the genesis for these bills that we saw last session. Senator Stanley picked up the report and read it and picked out the recommendations that he wanted to run with, and that's where the bills came from. And Tom mentioned that one of their recommendations that wasn't acted on was a recommendation that the General Assembly needed to provide more funding for alternatives. Interestingly, that was their number one recommendation. That was the first recommendation. Nobody took that and made a bill out of it, but really I think that's where we need to put our energy, because if we're going to have our ability to suspend and expel students reduced, either by the legislature or because we take some actions to reduce the use of suspension and expulsion if that's appropriate, we need the resources to address the behaviors that are causing the suspensions and expulsions in the first place. And so that's so that sort of leads me into what we expect to come out of this task force. And we do expect that we will have some formal priorities that will be hopefully approved by each of the associations that's participating in the task force. And when we come out with those, we're going to be asking you to help support us, because again, Tom and I and our our colleagues with the other associations can't do it all ourselves. The legislators really do need to hear from you. So when we come out with these formal priorities from the task force, you'll be hearing a lot about it. But I wanted to take a few minutes now to talk to you about what it's shaping up and what we expect to come out of the task force. And I think that we're going to have some legislative recommendations, some budgetary recommendations, and then we may also have some things that we work with DOE on that may not require legislation, but we're also working very closely with DOE. So with regard to the legislative recommendations, I think our number one, and this is sort of one of my my pet projects that I got on the list, is repealing the requirement that our principals report any conduct that might possibly constitute a criminal offense, even a minor misdemeanor, to law enforcement. We heard it earlier from Gillespie when he was giving his remarks, and he commented that Virginia was the #1 state for referrals of students to law enforcement, and I think at least everyone I was sitting with kind of had a collective because we know that, and the reason for that statistic is that the General Assembly requires us to report every incident that might possibly constitute even a minor misdemeanor to law enforcement. And so of course we're going to be #1 referring to law enforcement because we have to. So there have been a number of attempts over the last few years to repeal or modify this requirement. And we've always had success, I believe, in the education committees, but where we get hung up is in the courts committees. These bills get sent over to courts, and the Commonwealth's attorneys and the law enforcement associations kill the bills in those committees. So we've gotten our efforts a bit more organized over the last couple of years, and I'm hopeful that we might have a little better success in the upcoming session in getting this bill through, or getting farther than we've ever gotten before. And if there's one thing that the General Assembly could do to make a difference in the school to prison pipeline, and it would be to change this requirement. And so I think we all need to pull together and try to have this particular proposal become a reality. The next couple of things that I think are going to come out of our task force are going to be budgetary in nature. And one is we need more funding for the implementation of programs that prevent and address misbehavior so that we don't have to use suspensions. This could be PBIS, it could be effective school discipline, it could be the Virginia tiered systems of support. Those programs, when implemented with fidelity, have had really good results in reducing suspensions in the schools in which they're implemented. VDOE doesn't have the capacity at this point to provide the training to implement it across the Commonwealth. There's a waiting list. They're on there.
30% of the school systems. Yeah, go ahead. Right now, I believe 30% of school divisions are at some point in the program, and they have a waiting list of 45 school divisions. And so it's a matter of funding, both funding for DOE and funding for local school divisions to implement these programs. I think that's probably one of the #1 ways, other than taking away our ability to suspend. It's one of the #1 ways we can reduce suspensions and expulsions is implementing these programs in our public schools. Another budgetary recommendation that I expect to come out of the task force is for funding for alternative education programs. Currently, the General Assembly doesn't provide any funding for alternative programs for elementary students. So the focus seems to be on taking away or limiting our ability to suspend elementary school students, then we've got to have programs for these students if
if they need to be removed from the regular school setting. And right now, there's no funding for those programs. So we need funding at the elementary level, but we also need more funding at the secondary level. And so one of the proposals is that the funding needs to be such that every school division has access to alternative education programs for elementary and secondary students, whether that's regional alternative education programs or programs in the local school division, but every school division needs to have access to these programs for students at every level. And then the third sort of set of recommendations that we're working on and expect to come out of the task force center around the Department of Ed and probably won't require, at least in our talks with Dr. Staples, we don't think that they will require legislation. We think we can work with DOE to achieve these things. And one of those is to have the Department of Ed issue some guidelines for alternative education programs and alternatives to suspension and expulsion. As you heard earlier, Delegate Bagby had a bill last year that requires the Department of Ed to come up with guidelines for alternatives to suspensions and expulsions. Those guidelines have not yet been developed. So we would want to see that, as well as guidelines for implementing programs and other alternatives, implementing PBIS or VTS or what have you. And then the last one is to have the Department of Ed issue a new model code of student conduct. They currently have a code of conduct, and this is a recommendation that came out of one of the Just Children reports. And as Just Children found, and I agree, the current model code of conduct from DOE is largely just a recitation of the statutes regarding student discipline. And so what I think we want to see out of the Department of Ed is a model code of conduct that encompasses some of these ideas we're talking about with alternatives, with behavior supports, and things like that we can then use and adopt in our own codes of conduct. Because if the goal is to reduce the use of suspensions and expulsions, we need to take a look not only at our practices but at our policies. And that's one thing I often tell my clients, including some of you in this room, is when you call me and ask me what you should do, I tell you to look at your policy, and it's as if that was a brand new idea that no one had ever thought of. So if we want to change the outcome that we're getting, we need to start with our policies, and then we need to follow and implement our policies. And so I think that having a new and better and improved model from the state would go a long way in helping school boards develop that.
Okay. Now we want to talk a little bit about what are some of the things you can do now in getting ready for discussions with on these bills with your delegates and senators. And I've been asking superintendents as I've been going around the state this fall to engage your elected officials in this discussion. And I was a teacher for a long time, so unfortunately I'm going to give you some homework. When you're having these discussions, it's important that you have accurate and up-to-date data. You know, what the message is when we get to Richmond from the advocates are that we suspend children for the slightest little thing, and that we just put them on the street. Kick them out the door and put them on the street. You need to be able to explain exactly what happens with regard to looking at your suspension and expulsion data. You know, look at your demographics. You know, as to age, race, sex, grade, or whether they're disabled or non-disabled. You know that data. Know the trend. You know, what type of offenses are leading to suspension? You know, how many? The type. Are there differences in terms of looking at your data in terms of grade span or age? Do you have more middle school than high school? Is it vice versa? Who is doing this? So that when the questions come up, you can say that this is actually happening in our school division. And the last, because the one that in terms of looking at your data that I'm going to mention, because I don't think this is talked about a lot, is that you have maybe two types of child that you're working with. One that is a repeat offender, and as a superintendent, I used to feel that discipline was cumulative. We work with a child every now and then, for a number of times. They don't respond to what we've done at the school, and in order to maintain that instructional environment, we cannot have them there for right now. But then you also have those children that have a one-time problem. What percentage of your discipline is represented by that? And so in terms of repeat offenders or those with individual occurrences. The next thing we're going to ask you to do is look at your alt-ed programs. Do a type of program evaluation. I'm going to tell you that what I'm hearing is that alternative education, as it's implemented in the public schools, is going to be an issue for this coalition in the coming year. So look at that. Does it have a mission and vision? What are your purposes? More than getting the child out of the building. There needs to be a purpose that's educationally directed for that program. How does it relate to your overall instructional program? Are you looking at bringing this child back after a certain point? And how you do that? Is there a transition piece to it? And then look at your outcome data with your alt-ed program. How long do students stay? That's going to be an issue this year. They're going to begin looking at, are we using these alt-ed programs as dumping grounds? Does the program limit repeat offenders? Once a child goes and you bring them back, have you been able to intervene in a positive way? And what the original report in 2009 done by the Commission on Youth found that our regional alternative ed programs, when a child went there and they came back, very few times did they go back to alt-ed or have further problems. So there was a transition piece there was an intervention, and it was successful. And are you serving in those programs students who function better there than they do in the classroom, in the regular classroom? And if so, why? Is it the difference in structured environment? Whatever. What are these things that are making your system work or not work? And then in terms of what happens in your classrooms, what prevention strategies are you using? If you're part of VTSS, is that working? In our discussions with the department, they're feeling that even after year one, and it's a 3-year program, after year one, some school divisions are seeing a reduction in suspensions. If that's so, or if you're using PBIS in another way, look at what your programs are doing and seeing what the outcomes. In looking at that, and your result, who's being trained? Who needs to be trained in your buildings? These are all questions that you would ask of any program you're running in the schools. Whether it's your reading program, your math program, we need to look at what we're doing behaviorally as an instructional issue, along with alt-ed. I was in a meeting this summer in which they surveyed parents across the country on different issues, and there was a marked difference in what parents, how they felt about programs, and how the public feels about programs when we can tie it to what we're doing instructionally. And that's what we're saying with this. Discipline is not just punishment. Suspension and expulsion are not just punishment. They're part of a process. And that's what we have to help our elected officials understand. And when you're talking about it, and I just mentioned it briefly just now, when you're talking to these folks, emphasize the positive. What's working in your system? Has your suspension and expulsion rates declined? Have you had successful implementation of PBIs PBIS or the VTSS, have you limited repeat offenders coming back? Look, when you have that data, you can just say, what we're doing is working. Just don't tie our hands in those cases in which young people are not responding and we have to maintain a safe environment for everyone. Also help educate them in the availability programs, and Tracy mentioned a little bit, and the cost. The state does not provide a great deal of money for alternative education. You're making up the difference. What is that cost in terms of what you're having to expend, particularly not only at high school and middle school, but at the elementary level? It's not a bad time to talk about the support cap. The support cap and people that we have that provide added services to children besides teachers, that support cap hinders what we can do in terms of funding. Both VAS and in terms of professional development, both VAS and the JLOC reports that came out in 2015, it said that 76% of school divisions, because of the recession, had cut PD programs, professional development, had cut the training that would help us in lowering the suspension rates. And then Tracy mentioned it, emphasized that the state does not provide a dime that I'm aware of for K-5. And that is the one in which they wanted to totally do away with suspension, K-5. And that there is some limited funding for secondary.
I was going to say thanks, Tim, because you call me Tracy, but
I said Tracy.
Yeah, you did, but I won't.
Tracy. I don't want. That's all right. You can call me anything you want to. You usually do.
Sorry. So one of the things we really want to encourage you to do and ask you to do is meet with your legislators to talk about these things before January. And now that the governor VSBA has said that November is Take Your Legislator to School Month for years, forever. But now that the governor has said it, maybe we'll all be more active in doing it. But I really do urge you to meet with your legislators now. If you wait until January, or you wait until we have our conference in January, it's too late. I mean, still do that, but it's too late to start in January. We really all need to be active now. Don't even wait until November. Talk to your legislators about these issues every chance you get. And so in addition to the things that Tom has just mentioned, I think it's important to explain to legislators how the legislation that was proposed last year, limiting our ability to suspend or expel students, explain to them how that will negatively impact your school division. It could be cost of alternative education programs. It could be disruption to the other students in the classroom. It could be teacher retention. But all of these things, I think, are important to help our legislators understand. I really do think that there's a misconception among a lot of legislators, and I really heard it last session when these discipline bills were being debated. And there's some legislators who know that we're doing great things in the public schools, but there's some who don't know about it. And there's some who really have this perception that we're all in this business for the sole purpose of kicking kids out of school. And we need to change that perception. And the only way they're going to do it, they're not going to listen to me, and they're not going to listen to Tom. They need to hear it from you at the local level about the good things that you're doing, as Tom was saying, and about those times when it really is necessary to suspend a student out of school. One of the things that I think that was not in our favor last session was this Just Children report, the suspended progress report, and they talked about the number of students who were suspended, and they broke it down in the elementary school and the high school and the expulsions, and those numbers got kicked around as the end-all be-all, and we had this many thousand students suspended and this many thousand elementary school students suspended. But when you put it in the context of how many students we have in Virginia, it's a very, very small fraction. And we did that, and we talked about that, but they need to hear it from you. And so we need to change that narrative and make sure that our legislators understand, yes, we do have X number of suspensions, but that's in the context of this many students in our school division, and then you need to put some examples to it and explain what are the types of things that you're really using a long-term suspension or expulsion for. When these discipline bills were first presented in the subcommittee, the examples that were given by the patron of the bill were that we were suspending and expelling students for pulling pigtails and saying bad words and throwing paper airplanes, and I almost lost my mind when he said that. And so we really need to make sure that our legislators understand that we're not doing that, and that we're only using suspensions and expulsions for the most egregious circumstances. But they need to hear it from you, and they need the actual details and actual examples. And so I think it's really important that we educate our legislators so that they understand what we face every day, that they understand that we're already appropriately limiting the use of suspensions and expulsions, and that what we really need is support and funding for these other types of programs that will allow us really to further limit the use of suspensions and expulsions and keep our kids in school and provide the services that they need. And so meet with your legislators, meet with them now, meet with them in November, meet with them in January when I have our conferences, but don't let our January conference be the first time that they've heard from you about these issues, because it'll be too late. Tom, did you want to say anything before?
Just to reemphasize that point, in June, I met with some superintendents and legislators in the Roanoke area, and one of the legislators told me that if we want to make progress with this, we've got to act now. Now is the time. When they get to Richmond, often the opinions and the assumptions are already made. And so now is the time to reach out, invite them to come in, invite them to see things if you can, invite them to have a discussion, and to ask what questions they have. And because they're going to be hearing from advocates who are going to tell one side of the story. And so help clarify that.
So I think we have a few minutes for questions, if anyone has any questions on student discipline issues. Tom will be happy to answer your questions.
You mean Tim?
Russell Howe, Culpeper County. I don't really have a question, I have suggestions. In Culpeper, we were trying to get to the root causes of why these children, particularly elementary children, are having these episodes of violence. And there's cases of them throwing chairs at teachers, at their classmates, etc. One thing that's been great helpful is expansion of therapeutic day treatment programs. Right now, currently, only kids who have Medicaid are we able to put the day treatment counselor into the school to help these kids. So anything the legislators can do to expand the opportunity for mental health services for kids beyond Medicaid would be helpful, particularly with our young children. Secondly, is CSA funding. One of the things we've been doing in Culpeper is taking a lot of children for CHIN services, child in need of services, to court when they simply will not behave at school. Well, that pool of money is certainly limited. That brings in-home counselors, in many cases, into the child's home. It's attacking the root problem. Many of these children have been traumatized, child abuse and neglect cases, strengthening our CPS services, all the things that will prevent the trauma in the first place will stop these children coming to school and attacking their classmates and attacking their teachers.
I agree. I think, and you heard Delegate Bagby get at that. often what we see is the product of what happens those other hours outside of school. And I'll put another plug in for the support cap. Counselors, folks that can work with children one-on-one in the elementary, particularly grades, can make a very, very big difference. And it would allow us also to help do some more training in that area. But you're exactly right.
I'd just like to reiterate the issue of the support cap, especially as we consider the SOQs. Currently, our school social worker position is not part of our SOQ, and it is, we are seeing the effects of that lack at all levels of the system. Our school social workers are probably one of our most important sources of behavioral support for both staff, educators, and students, as well as parents. And we really need to increase the number and professional development for our school social workers across the board.
I like these questions that we don't actually have to
I
answer,
agree.
so keep it coming.
Tom, Stacy, I'm Mark Jones from Pennsylvania County. I have a statement first and a question. Thank you all for looking at this. We looked at our data last year. We have 9,100 students. Our school board or I either long-term suspend or expel about 50 per year. But we have a different definition of expulsion. Only 5 of those 50 were expelled without services. 45 went to our alternative school. Our division spends $600,000 per year to have a nice alternative school in a nice setting, full-day program where students, many are behind at the time, have an opportunity to catch up, and maybe that's part of their frustration. They can go there and work at their own pace, so we have a very good place for them. We receive $207,000 from the state, and half of that goes to Danville City. So we receive $103,000. That's for our 6 through 12 program. We also have a Ready for Success program that serves 1 to 10 K through 5 students that we fund as a division by ourselves. We take that on as an expense. That costs us, it's in the same building as our alternative school, but it costs us $110,000 per year. We are 128th of 132 in funding, so we're at the bottom in funding. We need additional help for alternative schools. We provide a good opportunity, we keep kids in school, but if we're going to do that, we have to have more money. So thank you.
And that's exactly the kind of information that delegates and senators need to hear. It's exactly the information.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. John Priest, Matthews County. When I ran for school board a few years ago, I ran on a campaign slogan of "It's cheaper to educate than it is to incarcerate." And the reason I ran on that campaign slogan was primarily because we had a large retirement sector that said, "I'm not going to pay to educate other people's children anymore." And tried to explain to them that if you don't educate them, you're going to wind up paying to have to incarcerate them when they are not educated and they turn to some other method of livelihood. But that whole campaign slogan isn't any more poignant than it is now in this issue. We're not really incarcerating, but it's very close to it if we are expelling or suspending them. And what we have to get through, not just to the state legislators, but to our local legislators, the fact that you have to fund our programs to try and keep our children in the classroom, because it will continue to be cheaper to educate them than it is to incarcerate them. And incarceration at home, if you want to call it that, by sending them home, it means that a parent is going to have to stay home with them. It also means that that parent is going to have to miss work. It means that we lose economic development or whatever because people aren't working, they have to stay home. So we have to have the programs in place, and it is, again, I say, cheaper to educate than it is to incarcerate. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree completely. And so for everyone who has made a comment like that, or any of the comments, and for everybody who sat at your seat and thought something similar, it's great to tell us. I'll sit here and listen to it all day. But these are the exact conversations you need to be having with your legislators.
Appreciate the previous speaker. One comment, all of these things are very interwoven. Our school districts are now, many of them, majority minority. Our teacher workforce is not. Our kids need to see people who look like them teaching them, and we need to address the things that were previously spoken to regarding culturally responsive teaching, and we need the money to do it.
Agree completely.
All right. Thank you and have a great day.